Could a new anti-collision system have stopped the tragic mid-air collision which happened over Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport back in 2025? Now, I want to make this absolutely clear from the start. The lack of this system was by no means the main factor behind this tragedy, but even so, there is a really good reason why the NTSB decided to highlight ACAS X in their investigation. I know the vast majority of you are familiar with this story, and I covered it over on the Mentour pilot channel just a few weeks ago, so I'm only going to give you the highlights here. What I'm talking about is the mid-air collision on the 29th of January 2025 between a CRJ 700, PSA Airlines Flight 5342, which was operated for American Airlines, and a Sikorsky Uniform Hotel 60 Lima helicopter, known by its call sign PAT-25. The crew in the CRJ 700 had initially been on approach towards runway 01 in Washington National before agreeing to switch over to runway 33 after the air traffic controller's request. The airport was really busy at that time, and in those kind of circumstances, those types of requests were quite common at that airport. Meanwhile, the crew in the Army helicopter were conducting a training flight which would take them past Washington National Airport via a helicopter route known as Route 4. And that meant that they would fly just under the approach path for aircraft landing on runway 33. Helicopters on Route 4 would need to fly at a maximum altitude of 200 feet, which would put them only about 75 feet below the glide path of any aircraft flying into runway 33. And that margin was only there if the helicopter kept over the eastern shoreline of the Potomac River. Any further out, including at the center of Route 4, that 75-foot clearance would get even smaller. Now, that's obviously way too close on paper, and in practice it was even worse because helicopter Route 4 didn't have any defined limits laterally. So a helicopter flying north or south along this route could drift substantially left or right and still technically be on the route, even if that meant that it was in the middle of an aircraft glide path. And that was before any vertical deviations from the helicopter was taken into account. Now, to put all of this into perspective, in the airline world, instrument flights use a minimum vertical separation of 1,000 feet between aircraft, and that can be reduced to 500 feet if visual flights are involved. But here, at Washington National Airport, this helicopter route had still been approved. Obviously, though, crossings with such a small margin were not allowed. And that had led controllers at DCA to have to either place helicopters into holding patterns when there was traffic on final to runway 33, or ask them to keep visual separation from that traffic and then pass behind. Still, this situation had led to thousands of close calls over several years before this accident happened, and to make matters even worse, there were also conflicts between helicopters and aircraft landing on runway 01 and runway 19. Now, there is obviously a lot more to all of this, involving the pilots, the air traffic controllers, those helicopter routes, and the way Washington National Airport has been operated over the years. And I'm explaining all of that in my very detailed video of this accident over on the Mentour pilot channel, which I really hope that you'll check out. But something that I mentioned only briefly in that video was the role that systems like ADSB-In and ACAS X could have played here. I didn't explore that in more detail because, again, other factors mattered more, and it was already an hour-long video. But still, ADSB was, or could have been, one of the many slices in the Swiss cheese that could have stopped this horrible accident from ever happening. It is actually a technology that has the potential to be the last line of defense in a lot of aircraft traffic conflicts, which is why I want to look closer at it today. And to understand it, we need to look at how technologies like GPS and ADSB became part of aviation in the first place. Today, GPS is the most popular type of global navigation satellite system, or GNSS, and in aviation, it is often our primary form of navigation. But it is easy to forget just how new it actually is. GPS didn't gain popularity in commercial aviation until the late 1990s or so, and it took even longer for the system to become the norm, as older aircraft were either retrofitted with GPS receivers or retired. Now, some of you might think that I'm going a little bit too far back here, but the point that I want to make is that it took us a really long time to figure out how to take full advantage of GPS, and what I'm about to explain today shows that we still haven't really gotten there. But after using GPS to help aircraft navigate safely, someone thought that if we could get those same aircraft to also transmit their GPS coordinates down to the ground, well, then we could probably make it a lot easier for air traffic controllers to do their job, especially at smaller airports where expensive radar installations weren't available. Until then, ground stations basically only tracked aircraft by using either primary or secondary radar, where primary radar is the normal kind of radar that you probably know of, where a radio signal bounces off the aircraft and then returns to the ground, allowing its direction and distance to be measured. Secondary radar works similarly, but it also gets information from the aircraft's transponders, and those are devices that, on top of location, also transmits details like its altitude, the aircraft type, airline, flight number, and so on. Now, secondary radar is a good system, but it still requires expensive ground stations with radar installations, and that's where GPS and ADSB comes in. ADSB stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, and its use is divided into two sections, ADSB out and ADSB in. ADSB out refers to the ADSB signal that comes out of the aircraft, where ADSB in refers to signals coming in. Nice and simple. So to help air traffic controllers see aircraft without having access to a radar, they needed aircraft to be equipped with ADSB out, which is why this was the first version of ADSB to be prioritized for adoption by aviation authorities around the world. For example, in the United States, aircraft operating in airspace where a transponder is required have been required to have ADSB out capability since 2020. Some other countries adopted ADSB even earlier, and in practice, commercial aircraft comfortably beat that deadline, but even so, ADSB out is still relatively new, especially in an industry where systems normally take decades to develop. Now, ADSB is also how Flight Radar 24 and other similar websites work, thanks to hundreds or even thousands of people who run ADSB receivers on the ground. And it's just amazing to see how software like that can just be installed by anyone and then work flawlessly. Now, I've run a company myself, and I've often thought that I wish my company's software could work like that, until I was told about today's sponsor, Odoo, that is. You see, Odoo is an all-in-one business management platform with more than 45 apps covering everything from invoicing and accounting to project management, inventory, website creation, and even more. Basically, if you run a business, Odoo will have something that will make your life easier. With Odoo's e-sign app, for example, you upload your document, choose your signatories, drag and drop the fields you need like name, date, email and signature, and then you select the signing order and schedule automatic reminders to avoid delays. And then you send it off. The recipients will be able to sign on any device in just a few clicks, and that's even if they don't have their own Odoo account. And then you will then be able to track the status of your documents in real time from a centralized dashboard to check whether they are pending, signed or declined. And you'll receive notifications whenever a status is updated. Now, all actions are obviously securely recorded and legally compliant with electronic signature standards in over 100 countries, including Europe and the United States, so you're covered wherever you're doing business. Now, your first Odoo app is completely free for life, including unlimited hosting and support, so to try it out yourself, scan this QR code or use the link in the description here below to get your free app. Thank you, Odoo, for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the video and have a closer look at ADSB-In. As I already mentioned, ADSB-In simply refers to ADSB signals from other sources which are then received by the aircraft, and these other sources aren't just aircraft, by the way. A lot of smaller general aviation and other newer aircraft already have ADSB-In various forms because it can do things like receive weather information overlaid on the plane's own position on a map in real time, for example, which is a really big deal for small planes that don't have their own weather radars. Now, if that system isn't available as an avionics package in the aircraft, well then ADSB-In can also be implemented by using a portable receiver, which can then feed information into an electronic flight bag or EFB, meaning an iPad or other tablets using apps. That, by the way, is something that quite a few military pilots also do, and it appears that the two helicopter pilots that were involved in the mid-air collision that I just talked about might have had iPads for this purpose, but that was never 100% established. Either way, whether this system is implemented in the aircraft's avionics or in an EFB, it can be used to give pilots better situational awareness, both in terms of where they are and for traffic deconfliction, because this system can also show pilots other aircraft around them.
Traffic, 10 o'clock, 4 miles, 1,000 feet below.
And that finally gets us to how ADSB can be used to improve and augment another system that airliners already use, which is TCAS. Like I said earlier, all aircraft have transponders, which are essentially specialized radios that transmit important information about the aircraft to radar stations on the ground. But another important function of modern aircraft transponders is that they can allow aircraft to see each other as well. And that led to the development of TCAS, which stands for Traffic Collision Avoidance System. Now, TCAS uses information from the transponders and then communicates with transponders on other aircraft automatically, and then they interrogate each other to work out if they are getting too close to each other. As they do this, the TCAS system displays the position of other relevant traffic on the aircraft's navigation display or other specific displays, and if the system determines that the planes are indeed getting too close, well then they will issue the first out of two available warnings or advisories. The first one is a traffic advisory, and it comes when the TCAS system determines that a collision is possible within the next 40 to 45 seconds. That will be heard in the cockpit as a loud traffic oral message, and simultaneously the TCAS display will change the symbol of the other aircraft into a yellow ring to further highlight it. Traffic. Now, that first message doesn't mean that the pilots immediately need to take action. It simply alerts them to the potential conflict and gives them time to look outside for it and consider other actions like informing air traffic control, for example. But the traffic advisory also prepares the pilots for the second step, a TCAS resolution advisory, or RA, which will be triggered if a collision is sensed to be around 25 seconds away. In that scenario, the two TCAS systems in the involved aircraft will start issuing actual commands to the pilots and will automatically coordinate these so that the crew in one aircraft will be instructed to climb, whilst the other might be told to descend. At the same time, the symbol for the other aircraft in the navigation display will turn red, and the symbology in the TCAS display will change to tell the pilots how to maneuver vertically. Obviously, these symbols and audio calls are designed to be as hard to ignore as possible, but they also have their limitations. In both cases, with a traffic advisory or a resolution advisory, the system isn't actually telling the pilots where the other traffic is. There will be a symbol appearing on the navigation display, but it doesn't come with exact information, like for example in which direction the aircraft is moving. So in practice, in order to figure that out, the pilots will need to keep looking at the symbol on their display and see how it's moving. But remember, this is an aircraft that might be getting closer and closer, so at this point most pilots would prefer to be looking outside to try and spot this traffic visually instead of being heads down on a screen. And this is where ADSB-In systems, and especially the new ACAS X system, is just superior. You see, ADSB-In has much more precision, both in terms of the position of the other aircraft and by containing much more information about what aircraft we're dealing with and what it is doing. ACAS X merges the information from the transponder and ADSB-In, greatly improving the function of TCAS. And thanks to that extra ADSB accuracy, ACAS X can give us both traffic advisories and resolution advisories earlier when needed. That in itself is a very welcome improvement, but ACAS X also goes much further than that. On our cockpit displays, the traffic information from ACAS X now includes the aircraft type as well as a directional symbol, basically an arrow to tell us how the other aircraft is moving. And we will also be able to see things like the other aircraft's vertical speed, which could show us, for example, if the crew in the other aircraft is reacting to a traffic advisory before it escalates into an RA. And not to mention that this will likely be able to filter out traffic that the old TCAS system would have seen as a threat, but in reality, due to its trajectory, really wouldn't be. And it gets even better. If you think about it, with the current TCAS, there is a pretty big step between a traffic advisory and a resolution advisory. As I already said, when we get a traffic advisory, all we're supposed to do is to look for the other traffic, talk to each other and to air traffic control, and get ready for what to do next. Then, if it escalates into a resolution advisory, we have to react immediately and follow closely what the system tells us. Now with ACAS X, we still have this binary set of TAs and RAs, but here the TA is becoming much more helpful, and not only because of that extra information on our navigation display. The even bigger change with an ACAS TA is the oral warning, where instead of just a traffic warning, the warning might sound more like something like this. Traffic, 2 o'clock, 3 miles, 300 feet above, descending. And that's a big deal, because it means that when we get a TA, we won't need to look inside to try and decode a vague traffic call. Instead, we pilots could immediately just look outside in the correct direction, and based on the distance and relative altitude, we then have a reasonably good idea of what to expect. That is a huge difference from the current system. And this difference becomes even bigger if you consider what happens when we're dealing with an imminent traffic conflict at low altitude. Just like the pilots in the CRJ did at the Washington National disaster. You see, one big limitation of the current TCAS system is that resolution advisories are inhibited at low altitudes, typically below 900 feet above ground level when the aircraft is in a descent, or 1,100 feet AGL when we're climbing. Now that is done in order to reduce nuisance warnings, and more importantly, because we really don't want an aircraft to get a descend RA when it's already very close to the terrain. But this limitation also means that in a case like the DCA disaster, even a simple TCAS traffic advisory could be seen as a nuisance call. But a ACAS XTA would sound very different, and in their investigation, the NTSB tested and simulated what this would have meant for the CRJ crew. And what they found was that if they would have had ACAS X, they would have received 2 separate traffic advisories. The first, 59 seconds before the collision, and it would have sounded something like this. Traffic, 12 o'clock, low, 3 miles, descending. Then, 35 seconds before the collision, they would have received the second warning. Traffic, 12 o'clock, low, 2 miles. But now, what they instead got from the old TCAS system was just a single TA, 19 seconds before the collision, which only said traffic, and nothing else. You see the difference? I should clarify here that I'm focusing on the CRJ crew because the US Army helicopter didn't have TCAS at all. But the helicopter pilots might have had iPad minis strapped to their kneeboards with the ForeFlight app running and connected to a Stratus ADSB receiver, giving them ADSB-In capability for better situational awareness. And that actually could have given them a TA 48 seconds before the collision, sounding something like this. Traffic, 10 o'clock, 2 nautical miles, 500 feet above. But if they actually had the system set up like this, which other Army pilots have now told me they likely didn't since the iPad screens were annoying when flying with night vision goggles, well then that TA would have only sounded out of the iPad speakers, which would obviously have been impossible to hear in the noisy helicopter cockpit. Again, TCAS and the lack of ACAS X was far from the biggest factor in this tragedy, and on top of everything else, the helicopter's transponder was found to be misconfigured, so it wasn't transmitting ADSB out at the time. But in any case, this still begs the question. If ACAS X is such a big improvement, which it clearly is, then why don't we have it already on commercial aircraft? Well, as I mentioned in my Mentour pilot video, there is sadly some bureaucracy involved here. Work on the ACAS X standard for fixed-wing aircraft was finalized in 2018, but EASA, Europe's aviation authority, didn't approve it until 2025. And of course, aircraft makers therefore didn't want to build aircraft with a system that wouldn't be certified for use in Europe. But that's not the whole story. As the NTSB report also explains, Boeing and Airbus now do offer ADSB-In on at least some of their aircraft models. American Airlines has equipped 300 of their Airbus A321s with the ADSB-In, and they have been testing it for over 2 years now, with their pilots being really enthusiastic about it. But sadly, it's still not that surprising that the industry is slow to adapt new technologies like this. Changes always come slowly in the aviation industry, and that's not just because of costs. Now, like I already said, ADSB out wasn't mandated until 2020. So even if EASA and the FAA had agreed on ACAS X back in 2018, chances are that the date when they would actually require the use of this system would come many years later. And that would be to give time for airlines to retrofit the system onto older aircraft, like the 20-year-old CRJ700 that was involved in the DCA accident. Now, that retrofit would likely include things like higher resolution displays in order to make additional information easier to read, and the industry would also need to carefully study how new threats like GPS jamming and spoofing will affect ACAS X. But one way or another, this is a system that we really need, and technologically, it's quite low-hanging fruit. We already have the hardware, so now we just need it to become mandatory. But what do you think? Did you know about this system and how much better it is? And are there other technologies out there that you would like to see in modern aircraft? Let me know in the comments here below, and remember that you can support the work that we do here by scanning this QR code with your phone or by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. It is completely free to test it out, and I would love to see you in my next hangout. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt, and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.